So, oh, all right. So, okay. So, I would like to start with the program outline, and so as you can, shall we go to the outline? Okay. Thank you, Shirley. So today, these are some of the agenda items that we'll cover today. Is an introduction to history of discrimination and racism in Canada. We'll sort of look at a timeline polling activity to look at the issue of racism in Canada, critical examination of discrimination, racism, and white supremacy, and then utilizing tools like a set of videos that we have recently developed under the Act to End Racism network. So we'll look at two videos to further examine how racism, how anti-Asian racism is manifested and perpetuated in our systems and in society. So, so if we're okay with this outline, we would like to proceed now to the first short video. So this one is a video about 3 minutes long. It is, maybe I will let you watch it and then we can talk about it. Okay, let's start.
And they will. Where were you?
Can we go back?
A history book will unfold before my eyes. The first time my grandchild asks, and they will, where were you? A history book will unfold before my eyes. Brittle spine snapping like a leather belt, some pages yet unwritten, dripping with the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors who crossed an ocean seeking a dream that turned out to be more like a myth. Where were you? When CPR foremen sent trembling Chinamen with frail fingers into the tunnels with sticks of dynamite, where were you? When head tax and immigration acts shut the door to the motherland, splitting countless Asian families down the middle like steamed pork buns, where were you? When the boat people landed in the dead of winter, promptly pushed to the ghettos like the rest of the rabble, when Nikkei fishing boats were impounded, their nets deemed a threat to wartime security, 22,000 Japanese sent to the mountains to concentrate on all the ways they weren't Canadian enough. The first time my grandchild comes to me with puffy eyes, asking me where I was the first time I got called a chink, asking me why it still hurts this bad in a country that says it welcomes us all, I will be forced to contend with all the times I've kept my head down and pulled my bootstraps up. A history of silence that speaks louder than a Hiroshima bomb. We have never been a loud people, just hardworking. After all, chopsticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never hurt you, right? So study hard, Zai. Don't talk back. We are lucky to be here, to be doctors, lawyers, engineers. Railroads and laundromats, prosperity and graduation caps. They might not love us like they love our food, but they pay our mortgages while we pay our dues. When my grandchild asks, so what did you do? When they knelt on a black man's neck till he died. When they trespassed and attacked First Nations healing camps. When they called it Kung Flu and spit on our grandmas at bus stops. What did you do? And where were you? When black Canadians paved the way for our emancipation. When local natives pulled our broken bodies from collapsed railroad tunnels and nursed us back to health, bending cedar and weaving bamboo, did you fight for them when they fought for you? I want to tell them. We tried. We stood. We fought. We could. No longer only doctors, lawyers, engineers, but artists, athletes, allies, activists. Every Chinatown and Little Manila an act of defiance. Every stoic action mistaken for silence. Here we are on the shoulders of humble giants. Their guidance meant survival so that we can now speak, so we can now strive, so we can now struggle, so we can now thrive. When they ask me what I did, I want to tell them, I tried.
So thank you, Shirley. Okay, a bit of discussion on this. So generally, how do you feel about this video? What do you think are some of the key messages from this short documentary? Anyone? Okay, I'm trying to see if I can see more people here. Okay.
if you stop sharing, then people can show up.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, hello. Okay, so I hope that most of you were able to catch the short video. It's actually entitled History of Silence, produced by Sean Tees, a poet. So anyone would like to share what you think of the video? What do you think are some of the messages? Were you able to catch some of the historical and also current events that was actually referenced in the video?
It's very strong. Like it hits my heart. Like it hits me right there.
Yeah. So
yeah, I think one of the messages was the need to collaborate between parties, to work together, different groups that are being discriminated against.
Right. So
Jennifer has her hands up.
Right, Jennifer, please go ahead.
There were two things I wanted to mention. I noticed that there were references to the increased anti-Asian, the racism that we experienced during the pandemic, and also that racism is not only for a certain period of time, that it also evolves over generations. So for example, my grandchild or my parents will experience similar things.
Right. So really, it provides both a historical as well as some current reference to some of the current events that's happening in the world as well as in Canadian society, right? When they mentioned, George Floyd, there was reference, the anti-Indigenous racism, and also how when Chinese workers who were building the railroad, when they were die, it was actually Indigenous people who actually took them in and nursed them back to health. So we also have a special relationship with Indigenous people of Canada. So it has actually many references to racism in the past as well as in the current time. So I think Angela, you used the word. I think it hit your heart. It was powerful to you. Anyone like to talk about why do you think the creator of this documentary used the relationship between a grandchild and a grandparent to talk about this issue of racism? Any thoughts on that? Angela?
Well, it gives me the feeling that it has never stopped. Like from the beginning, like the railway workers, all the while until now, it has never stopped.
Right. So, so it is true that I think a few of you actually have mentioned this, that we have a long history of racism in this country. I think that there were times that we are more comfortable to talk about it, to acknowledge it than others. But I think one of the key themes is that it has always been part of Canada. And also it's also, I think, the creator's intention to really talk about the call to Asian Canadians at this challenging time for our communities to reflect about our silence. And so while we are aware of this kind of mistreatments, but generally speaking, I think that people are talking about why we have been kept silent most of the time, and whether we actually need to actually reflect on the reason behind that. So Asian Canadians have and continue to endure various kinds of mistreatments over our century-long presence in Canada. So I trust, we generally agree that we have been relatively silent on our experience of racism. And there was a time that it was almost impossible for us to speak up and have a voice when we actually suffer from legislated discrimination. But I hope that you agree, while change often do not happen fast enough, but there have been changes, both from our communities, our citizenship, as well as the broader society. So especially, over the past few months, there have been more awareness and consciousness, raised due to the many forms of racism that have been surfacing or being amplified. So, so the poet, you know, used that child, that grandchild and adult relationship to remind us the interrelationship between our actions and inactions and its impacts on our future generations. So, so many of you are familiar with the proverb that says, one generation plants the trees, another generation gets the shade, right? So we can all do something to address injustice. So now the video mentioned a few key historical and current markers, events. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna spend the next few minutes to take a quick travel through time to look at discrimination and racism in Canada. So this is a quote that would take us to the, you know, to the next item. You know, this is a famous quote from Confucius: study the past if you would define the future. So we need to know our past to have a better understanding of our current state so that we can actually hopefully improve the future. So we're going to warm up with some essential facts here. So in 1857, the discovery of gold in present-day British Columbia, Fraser Valley, River Valley area began the Chinese immigration to that region. And this increased when Chinese workers arrived in the 1880s to help build the Canadian Railway. So about 15,000 workers came. And so it was recorded about one for each mile, you know, of the railroad in the British Columbia area, one Chinese worker died. And that is the extent of the Chinese Canadians' contribution to the building of this national railway. And by the way, the first arrival of Chinese Canadian, it actually dates back to 1788. And then in 1895, Chinese, Japanese, and East Indian immigrants were denied the vote in British Columbia and then across the country. In 1907, race riots in Vancouver directed against Japanese, Chinese, and East Indian immigrants. And then 1922, Chinese students can only attend one of two Chinese-only schools in Victoria's Northward district. And all primary students over 12 were excluded from school, as were students over 17. So, so essentially, not only Asian Canadians were segregated, of course, Indigenous children were sent to residential school. We had segregated cemeteries for Asian and Black people, segregated schools, segregated facilities, and up until, you know, a few decades ago. So, and in 1923 was the special Immigration Act known as the Chinese Exclusion Act that essentially, after the head tax was not successful in stopping the Chinese from immigrating to Canada, an act, a policy was passed in Ottawa in Parliament called the Chinese Exclusion Act that stopped all Chinese immigrants coming to Canada. And that lasted for about 23 years, almost a quarter of a century. That's why amongst many racialized communities in Canada, the Chinese Canadian community's development was actually hugely interrupted. So while we have a long history in Canada, and the Chinese community actually is comprised of many first generation Canadians. I also would like to mention that I think it's also important to recognize another significant historical fact that have impacted East Asian Canadians is the in the 1940s, the Japanese Canadians were interned and with all their life possessions and properties taken. That happened in 1942. Okay, so next. Now we'll ramp things up a notch and now have you do some work with some, in response to some incidents of racism in Canada through some polling exercise. So the idea is for you to identify the time frame or the year the presented incident or issue happened in Canada. So choose the timeline, the year, the time period that you think that incident happened, by clicking on it and submit it. So now let's do a set of about 4 here. So the first question, get ready. A survey of Ontario real estate agents showed that 27 of 30 agencies would sell to whites only if so requested. So your pick, did it happen in the 1900s, 1950, 1975, or 2000?
I don't see the poll showing.
Yeah, I know. So how do people choose, Shirley?
I have no problem seeing it.
I know, but they have, don't they? They have to choose one.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Can people choose?
Yeah, no, I have no problem. It's Pui-Ling Chen here.
Oh, okay.
I just use the mouse on the screen and just click on it.
Excellent. Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad to hear because I cannot do it here. Maybe because I'm participating. So okay, so if people can pick it, then that's good. Then we're going to move on to question number 2. So European parents complain about Chinese students being dirty, poor-mannered, and obstructed the progress of the class. So the school board made Chinese students pass an English exam before being allowed into public school. So do you think that it happened in 1850, 1900, 1950, or 1995?
75, is it, on your screen?
I think, are people doing the poll right now?
Yeah, I'm looking at the poll.
I don't see any voted, like it, well, okay, I see one now. One people, you can just click, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So are people clicking? Because
only one. Only one.
Maybe I'm the only one.
I think it's because the poll you have to do all 4 questions and then submit.
Right, yeah, I haven't submitted.
Oh, okay.
So I think okay, so I think it's going to be
That's okay. I can do that.
Oh, I guess it's set up as one big poll for them, right?
Now I
we have
people are starting to vote, like are starting to answer questions. Should we go back to the first one again?
Sure. Okay, sure. We'll take time. So the servant is the Ontario real estate agent. So so they would actually sell the house to white people only if they were requested. So what do you think? 1990, 1950, 1975, or 2000?
75.
People are answering now, like I see 7 answers. Maybe you can just do it one by one, Teresa, it's easier. If
All right.
Sorry, Teresa, sorry. Basically the how this poll working is, we have 3 polls. Each one will have several questions. So we need let people finish their question and submit, and then you can end the polling. So you will see how people answer, and then you answer from there. So we can't do like one question by one question, but we can do it one poll by one poll. That's how it's work.
Fine. Then we can, should I move the poll questions? Now I move to the second question.
Once it's finished, you should end the polling. If you can see, like, if people finish.
So people can see all of the 4 questions. I see. Okay. People can see all of the 4 questions on their screen. So they can just answer all of the 4 questions now, right?
Yes.
All right. So, okay, maybe just in case, I'll read the third one. The third one is Prime Minister Barbados, Grantley Adams, was denied a room in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Montreal due to regulations. So the time period for you to choose, 1850, 1900, 1950, or 1975. And then the fourth one is a French newspaper uses the headline, Yellow Alert, indicating another global yellow peril, insurgents in the face of a pandemic. So when did this happen? 50, 1975, 2000, or 2020? So make your choices, and then we can talk about the, we can share, you know, the time that the incident happened.
So I will end the polling now, right? For consideration of time, okay?
Yeah, I agree. So we do have.
We can review the results now.
Sure.
You can share the results so everyone can see.
Share results, okay.
Okay, so so the answer for the first one in terms of the real estate agent request is 1978. So the closest to it would be 1975. Okay, and then the second one, the parents complain about Chinese students being dirty, poor. This is very interesting. So most people who participated chose the most recent, which is 1975, and it was actually 1907. And so it's very interesting because yeah, it's a centuries different. But like I think many of you alerted to after watching the first video, how a lot of things actually have been there, you know, for a long time. So the Prime Minister of Barbados that was actually denied a room, it actually happened in 1954. So the closest would be 1950s. So like I said, Canada did have segregation, usage of public facilities, and that's the one example of such policy and practice. So the French newspaper, this actually happened in 2020. So for those of you who you know heard of the term yellow peril, so it originated in the 1800s in Germany first, and then of course it was used many times over, and sadly, so you know it was actually used just not last year. And on a personal note, after I won my first election in 1995, I received a letter from someone who took time to write me and call me a yellow peril after I won my first election as the school board trustee. So so these you know, some of the you know, history of racism in our country. So we have one more. So let's do the second set, the second poll. Okay, so Environic Institute online survey found 20% of respondents expressed some form of racial discrimination, with 38% experienced racial discrimination in the workplace and on the street. So when do you think that happened? 2000, 2005, 6, 2019? Okay, so a survey of employment agencies in Halifax, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver, carried out by the Canadian Civil Liberty Association, found that 17 of 25 randomly selected agencies were willing to supply employees with only white workers, employers with only white workers. So when do you think that happened? 1900, 1950s, 1975, or 2000? And SARS cases appear in Canada. Media portrayed the disease as deadly, fearful, and exotic. This contributed to public fears towards Asian communities and led to racial discrimination and harassment. So everybody got that one, 2000. So Crazy Rich Asian sequel loses Asian co-writer over pay disparity. Okay, so you have participated. So the Environic Institute survey actually took place in 2019. So most of you got that. And then the survey about Headhunter Employment Agency that actually happened in 1980. So I think most of you identify, I think the closest to it, 1975. And so the next one is SARS, and most of you probably remember it happened in 2003. So so 2000 would be the closest to it. And then the Crazy Rich Asian sequel, that happened in 2019. So 2020 would be the closest time period to that. So let's do 3 more. I actually have a set of hundreds examples, but we're just doing 3 more for today. So let's do the last one. So Aryan Nation burned a cross in Provost, Alberta. So when do you think that happened? 1970s, 80s, 90s, or 2000? Redress campaign to address the discriminatory treatment of Chinese Canadians under Head Tax and Chinese Exclusion Act. The campaign started in Vancouver. When did that start? In 1950, 80s, 2000, or 2005? So the city of Windsor, Ontario, segregates its public facilities. Okay. So, okay. You're still entering your choices here. I think the majority of you got the first one. It happened right in 1990, the burning the cross in Provost, Alberta. So, and then the redress campaign to address the head tax, the Chinese head tax, actually it happened in 1984. So, and then the city of Windsor, segregated its public facilities. It was in 1975. So that's okay. That's the polls that we chose for today's session to as a way to look at the history of racism in Canada. Any thoughts about, any surprises about from this exercise for you, for anyone? Any surprises?
No, I would like to take a minute to go back to your original questions on the video. That why is it? Because what is the difference between the two generations? What I find that I came over here in 1973, so I kind of caught the tail end of it, and also I grew up in Hong Kong. The older generation of Chinese, for various reasons, because they were afraid to speak up. And they were so ashamed of themselves that they don't explain it to the younger generation. So there is a major disconnect between the two. So that was my initial reaction when I saw the video, because there are so many young Asian Canadian that really did not understand or did not even hear it from their parents and what they've gone through, because it was so tough for them.
Yes, certainly. I think that's certainly that element that is shared between the Chinese and the Japanese Canadians in terms of the experience with internment, with the head tax, with all the legislated racism that happened. And when it's actually, when it was so pervasive in society, instead of, I also came in the 70s. And shortly after that, of course, the Canadian government declared the Multiculturalism Act, even though it is a visionary policy, but it's still spelled out, I think, a vision and a desire to address issues of equity and equality, whereas before it's just that we don't want you to come, and we don't want your family to be here. So I think that the overall atmosphere is very different. I think that also speaks to, I think, impact the psyche of the citizen, of also people who belong to certain groups. Any particular items that surprise you in terms of segregation, in terms of the response by entities like employment agencies, like the real estate, entities? Did that surprise you? Oh, no one was surprised? Okay.
No.
Okay. So I think that certainly there have been greater awareness and consciousness about the existence of racism in this country. So so I hope that you find that somewhat useful in terms of making a case about discrimination and racism in Canada. And so before we actually explore some of the reasons that have kept us silent or that actually some of the factors that continue to perpetuate anti-Asian racism, we would like to spend just a few minutes to get grounded with some basic terms linked to the subject of racism. I see that we actually have a little summary slide here about, this is actually from the Environic survey, where people actually experience racial discrimination in Canada. So almost 40% happen on the street, and then another 40% happens in the workplace, and then 30% in our education entities, and then 30% in stores and restaurants. And of course, during the pandemic, when most people, you know, for those who could, stay home. Actually, a lot of incidents of discrimination actually happen in places like grocery stores, but still a lot of them happen in public spaces. Okay. So, like I said earlier, so before we actually delve a little bit deeper to look at how racism is perpetuated in society, we'll spend a few minutes to ground ourselves with some of the basic terms here. So, oh, can you go back? Sure, yeah. So as you can see here, we have I'm going to touch on the terms, and then I'll provide a brief description and some example. So, you know, as someone who actually started doing this work in the early 1990s, it has been a journey for me in terms of learning about discrimination, about racism, talking about this, acting on, you know, taking action to address this issue. It really is a journey. And so I will be going through this rather quickly today. So I hope that you feel comfortable to stop and ask questions if you really want to you have a question, you need clarification. Otherwise, you know, I'd be happy to share the slide with you afterwards, and for you to continue to think about some of these issues. So so the concept that we'll be covering here, prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, leading to racism, and then also white supremacy. Okay, so we'll look at each of these concepts separately.
Kevin, I have a question.
Oh, Kevin, yes. Do you have a question?
Yeah,
Kevin?
Teresa, thank you for the great presentation. For me, the history part of the pool, I'm not familiar, but this chart, I would use a systematically discrimination chart, the hierarchy right here. And you can read different ways. Now, something I'm not sure is off the topic. We also have a confirmative bias right here. So from generation by generation, the law, the practice, our mind, we like default, we think the law is great, follow the law, and the white people, they're doing right thing, so they're better than a workplace, better on the public. I'm not sure I can share one story, you have time. Can I share one story quickly?
I don't think we have enough time.
Okay,
yeah.
So I'm gonna stop here.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing your perspective. And if we do have time at the end, maybe I'll come back to you. Okay, thank you. Okay, so if I may, we'll just take some time to cover some of these key concepts. So the word prejudice it literally means to prejudge. So these are preconceived ideas or belief about a person or group or groups of people that may or may not be based on reason or reality. And so some of the examples are, well, like my mother would say, I don't think people should wear jeans to school, any kind of education entity. So it's just based on a personal preference. So some other examples are, okay, so I cannot see the slide. Asian Canadians are not good communicators. They're bad communicators. The other is Asian women or Chinese women are bad drivers. So these are preconceived ideas that actually cannot be backed up by facts. Okay, so that's prejudging. Okay, we all do that because we have to do that because at any given moment we're bombarded by so many different stimulus, right, to our system that we have to make some kind of quick judgment that's based on some prior experience, how we've been socialized, and so we all do it. It's almost part of human nature. But we just need to be conscious about we actually do this. So, and then next is stereotyping. So stereotyping, the definition, one of the definition for stereotyping is an overgeneralization of a group of people and applying the same characteristics to all people of this group, regardless, overlooking the individual differences. So some stereotypes are Chinese people are good with math. And so Chinese women or Asian women are submissive. So these are stereotypes, certain characteristics that you apply to all people, like all Chinese women. Chinese people are good with math. So, well, because I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to go and have a lot of discussion on this. But of course, we all know that not all Chinese people are good with math. And of course, not all Chinese women are bad drivers. So now the next concept that we cover here is the term discrimination. So discrimination is defined as the denial of equal treatment and opportunity to individuals or groups because of personal characteristics and membership in specific groups. So now, so that what that means, like in this case, with our focus on Asian Canadians, is that in an organization that you could actually see evidence of unequal treatment and unequal opportunity to a group of people because of their racial membership. So think about Canadian universities. We have not yet, in the history of Canada, had a university president of Chinese Canadian descent. So, so we want to examine why. And then, of course, if you look at this, the reports year after year, decade after decade, women, Indigenous people, people of color are underrepresented at the corporate board, at the nonprofit board table, and also in most senior leadership tables. So this definition is taken from a more Canadian employment equity kind of context. So it makes specific reference to the area of access to education, to housing, to healthcare, employment, and access to services, goods, and facilities. So some examples, if you remember, I think it happened last year to this woman, Indigenous woman in Montreal, and she videotaped the treatment of her before she died by her telephone. So we can see how she was mistreated by a public health system. So that is one example. And the other is an example that we use. Well, we use the word Jessica, or it could be Young Choi. It can be, any name like that. That actually is not suited to be promoted to the manager role because she lacks the drive, the confidence. She's not firm. She's not assertive. She's not sociable. And sometimes the phrase could be, we already have a manager who's Asian. We already have a engineer manager who's Chinese. So these are some of the examples of discrimination. What we're trying to say is the difference between stereotyping, which is a generalization, and discrimination is this is action. So people who can take action to deny people opportunities to actually apply differential treatment on people constitute discrimination. So it's no longer an attitude and is now an action. Okay, next. So, discrimination is actually actions based on prejudice and stereotypes. Because I believe, because the person who have the power to give a promotion to someone believe that people who actually can be in managerial position should be communicating in certain ways, should be actually like to play golf or hockey, and as part of the criteria, they now can actually act on those prejudices and preferences and stereotypes. So in terms of discrimination, there are generally different forms of discrimination, and the ones that we'll touch on here is overt discrimination, unequal treatment, and systemic discrimination. Okay, so overt discrimination is the granting or denying of certain rights to certain groups of individuals. So it's very visible. You can actually see it, you can feel it, you can hear it. And so the example would be the Chinese Health Tax and Exclusion Act. So unequal treatment, the differential treatment of one group in comparison with another because of certain characteristics. So as we all know that to date, women still get less pay in certain area, in some of the workplaces, women get less pay than men. And also, according to Statistics Canada, racialized Canadians make 81 cents to every dollar that white Canadians make today. So, and then in regard to part of the immigration policy in Canada, when the Chinese people were immigrating to this country in the beginning, we came as laborers, and while European people came with they were given free land. So, so differential treatment. Okay, next, systemic discrimination. These are policies and practices embedded, entrenched in established organizations or institutions, which result in the exclusion or promotion of designated groups. So we know that who is excluded from top jobs and top decision-making roles, and who have been promoted. So mostly white men have been promoted and benefited, and whereas women, Indigenous people, and racialized Canadians have been excluded from those opportunities. So persistent underrepresentation of racialized Canadians, including Chinese Canadian at decision-making tables. The 2020 Angus Reid Institute survey found that 64% of Chinese Canadian reported feeling coverage from North American news outlets have led to negative views of people of Chinese ethnicity in Canada. So this is a practice. So this is something that's nice and simple for us to remember. What constitutes systemic discrimination? Because as of last year, our Prime Minister essentially challenged all public entities in this country to acknowledge the existence of systemic racism in all of our public entities. Because systemic discrimination is defined by impact, not intent. It is not about your intent. It is by impact. If in your organization, you see that you don't have women, racialized Canadians represented throughout the organization, from volunteer to workers, to coordinators, to managers, to board members, then that is the impact. That is what constitutes the systemic discrimination. It is not the intent. We don't want, we would like to be reflective. We would like to be representative. We would like to be inclusive, but we are not. So it is the intent, the impact that counts. Okay, so next, racism. So now racism now refers to a system in which one group of people exercises power over another. So like the person who actually had the power to determine whether to give a person a promotion, an advancement, and even open the door to allow people to have those programs and services. So those people have power. So there's one group of people that exercise power over another on the basis of skin color is racism. And so while we can all be racial discriminate different groups of people, within the Canadian context, white people have the power to exercise racism. So because if we look at the impact, who are in position of power in our government, in the organization, in our nonprofit sectors, in the education system, everywhere. If you look at who actually have the exercise, have the power to make decisions, whether to address or not address racism, that constitute racism, is the institutional power behind the people who actually make decisions. So racism is prejudice, discrimination, plus the backup of institutional power, used to the advantage of one group and the disadvantage of another, okay? And internalized racism, I know that we're covering a lot today in a short period of time, but it's important to introduce this concept because this is about, oftentimes it's about our children. When they actually do not see themselves reflected in the education system, they don't see a positive image of their people reflected in media, in government, then they would actually accept the dominant society's racist views and stereotypes and biases of the ethnic group, and actually start to believe that we are not good enough. So we are not good enough to be leaders in this country. We're not good enough to be superintendent of our school. We're not good enough to be school principals in this country. So it have detrimental effect on the development of the identity and the development of racialized Canadians. So I apologize, we started late and we're covering lots of concepts. So we, unless, we'll try to come back if you have questions about this, but now I'm gonna move on to actually watch the video. And this one is called on the Perpetual Foreigner.
Where are you from? No. What I mean is, where are you from? Where are you originally from?
And it's asked over and over again, and it could be like a hamster in a wheel. It's like a wheel I never got off.
It's that sense of, I am not one of you. I am the other percent. I don't belong.
For Asian Canadians, being seen as an outsider is part of our reality. We call this the perpetual foreigner stereotype.
When you say the word perpetual foreigner, I think of the word other.
No matter how long you've lived in North America, in Canada, you're always from away.
Never considered part of the fabric of the culture, the society, the country, the government.
Quand même, je crois au Québec, comme aussi à travers le Canada, un racisme systémique qui est ordinaire, qui est aussi simple que justement la question de tu viens d'où, la question de représentativité.
The perpetual foreigner stereotype is the false belief that no matter where you were born or raised, whatever your history, as a visible minority, you will never be fully Canadian.
Because they visibly look different from perhaps the automatic assumption that one may have that Canadians should look like a white person.
Even though that's constructed belonging, right? They actually don't belong here. They were migrants too to this place.
Not only does this completely ignore the history and presence of Canada's Indigenous peoples, but it judges someone's right to belong based on their looks rather than where they were born or their participation or contribution to society. This is a continuation of a long history of exclusion and fear of Asian Canadians, like the labeling of Japanese Canadians in World War II as enemy aliens and spies.
Japanese living in the West Coast, we were a threat to the federal government. The kind of thinking at the time was that the Japanese were going to come and invade Canada.
By the end of the war, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were forcibly relocated and sent to internment camps, with nearly 4,000 of them eventually exiled to Japan, a country that was completely foreign to them. Only after having been wrongly interned did Japanese Canadians get the right to vote in 1949. Similarly, it was only after risking their lives to fight for Canada in World War II that Chinese Canadians were granted full citizenship and the right to vote in 1947. The attitudes that labeled Asian Canadians as second-class citizens still persist to this day.
Regardless of our citizenship, we're also then deemed like not always Canadian. Like we're expected to kind of justify our belonging here.
At work, Asians may be seen as being less qualified or competent based on their appearance and accent. Speaking with an accent becomes a hurdle to overcome and gives the false impression of being uneducated and unintelligent.
It would only be when I was an adult did I learn what my father's salary was, and seeing how he was treated at work and how his skill set was diminished was something that we had to process after he was forced into retirement.
Stereotypes will reinforce the belief that Asian people are just good workers.
And the irony is that although they're seen as cheap labor force, many temporary foreign workers are actually educated. They have to take on this work, but many of them actually have education. Like some of them have a post-secondary education. But again, because they're occupying that rung in the economic hierarchy, they're seen as cheap and also disposable labor.
We are here, most Asian communities are here by virtue of taking up places in the economy because slavery was abolished, right? And because we can be deemed as folks who can work for minimum wage, less than humane wages. It's historically grounded, but it's also seen evident in the everyday about who works the menial jobs that no one, the regular white Canadian does not want to work.
During the pandemic, the perpetual foreigner stereotype has contributed to the increase in racist attacks on Asians.
Non! Touche pas! Touche pas, man! Arrête! C'est toi qui m'harcèles!
Qui est asiatique, hein? On se bat contre vous autres, les Chinois. Chinese democracy. Okay? Le Japon aussi. Okay? Or you.
My roommate and I were attacked during broad daylight on the main street in the city of Montreal. A man approached us from behind and started to strangle my roommate and was saying something like, "It's your fault." I knew what this was about. And that's exactly why I'm making this video today, is because we have to stop this new hate against Asians.
In the first time in 10 years that I felt like, I would maybe watch my back a little bit if I had to go out.
Je pense que juste le fait de se poser la question, est-ce que je dois me cacher ou pas, ben, il y a un problème.
How do we put an end to the stereotype of the perpetual foreigner? As a society, we need to put in place more inclusive practices and encourage equity in the workplace.
Workers' rights and human rights, they're intertwined.
This impact of marginalization, not being given equal opportunities, being seen as the other or the foreigner, those are impacts that are significant in our day-to-day life and our ability to contribute to society in the best way to, feel our potential.
Should be working together to collectively and collaboratively address our common concerns because we are actually seeking the same thing, equity and equality for all people.
Education is so important. And, it's a continuing education from both sides. And then, of course, communication, education and then communication, they go hand in hand.
If we don't start the discussion, who will?
Okay, so we'll maybe have a short little discussion before we actually move on to watch the last video today. So anyone would like to share, you know, some of your thoughts? Like what are some of the example of words, comments, and actions used in the video that help you to understand the impact of othering, you know, whether it's in the past or in the present? Can you name some of the examples that was used to create this, you know, this feeling, this concept of othering, being the other? Or your general reaction to, you know, what this what this video tried to convey? Kevin?
Yes, thank you. So each effort makes sense. Like your presentation from the third layer, discrimination is take action. So they take action, discrimination. That's apple to apple. We have to take action. Start from there. And also, I really like your chart. It's and also on presentation on a video, they say education and communication. Our education. One side of education we don't have in a textbook, no anywhere else. We have to build up for our own. For example, culture confidence. Right. East Western is different. It's different. We talk about in Chinese, I'm using speak Mandarin, is 密不可分. We all connected. However, our Western from the religion to say good or evil, heaven or evil. So that's totally different. That's a competition come up. We value humble, they value competition. So eventually it's like we value our belief system, Dao, right? Daoism. I would say that's for cross to all Eastern culture, include Chinese culture.
So I think that I think we're at the stage, you know, in terms of development of a country, that we no longer should just talk about inclusion and equity and diversity, but we really need to actually have people walk the talk. So how are they actually incorporating what you just referred to as different value systems, different life experiences, different worldviews into the education system, into the workplace, and be reflected in throughout public entities, right? Because this is how actually a public entity convey who is Canadian and who are not. So it is through, you know, the images they use. It is through, you know, how they treat people who actually come with a different life experience and worldview. And it is look at how they actually treat the different groups of people, and also how they respond when people say, go home, go back to your country. And why do people feel that they can do that? It's because oftentimes there's no consequence when those things happen. So that links back to systemic discrimination. When people's racist action meet with no consequence, then people will continue to do it. And that's how some of the racism being perpetuated in Canada after we talk about multiculturalism and inclusion for decades. So we now need our systems to take action. Okay, so with that, we'll now move on to watch the last video today, which is about 7.5 minutes long. And it is on the concept of the model minority myth.
Smart, borderline nerdy.
Being driven to success.
Who don't cause trouble.
Hardworking.
And we not call for attention to oneself.
Smart, successful, wealthy, hardworking, and self-reliant. These are some words we often associate with Asian communities across Canada. They are also stereotypes perpetuating what we call the model minority myth. While some of us may not be familiar with the term, it's a feeling that we've all encountered to varying degrees. The model minority myth depicts all Asian Canadians as highly intelligent and hardworking, a shining example of how to overcome discrimination and hardship. In other words, we are the law-abiding citizens, the favored neighbors, and the non-threatening group of color. What on the surface may seem like outstanding praise becomes a double-edged sword. Here's how the model minority myth is problematic. It contributes to a culture of silence. Being pressured to meet the standard of the so-called good immigrant, Asian Canadians are often hesitant to speak out against social injustice, including recent incidents of anti-Asian violence related to the coronavirus pandemic.
There's very much this culture of like, just keep your head down and work hard and everything will be okay.
Kind of underneath that is this idea that we've already given you this opportunity. Now you want more, you want the opportunity to speak your mind.
Between 1881 and 1884, over 17,000 Chinese people migrated to Canada to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. Targeted by racist policies, Chinese workers were exploited by being paid lower wages. Likewise, in 1942, Japanese Canadians under the War Measures Act had their possessions seized and sold. Forcibly interned, many were then displaced to interior regions of Canada to work as indentured laborers for little pay, often under inhumane conditions.
My family were evacuated from Vancouver to a little town called Raymond as a beet worker. I think my father worked for something like 25 cents an hour. At our farm, we were in an old chicken coop. I could remember in the mornings when we woke up, there was no insulation. It was absolutely cold, and the sheet would be frozen where you breathe, and it would be a cone.
Today, Asian communities face similar kinds of exploitation and discrimination that they faced back then.
As a temporary foreign worker, your stay in Canada is dependent on a singular employer. You cannot work for any other company. During the early weeks of the pandemic, many of the workers in the meat plants actually started to notice that things are happening. There's something wrong happening on the floor of the factories. But they were not heard. And so it took the death of a worker for the public to know the situation and force the closure temporarily of the meat plants. Because their situations are not known or not probably known but not fully acknowledged. And therefore, public system decisions do not address their vulnerabilities. Of course, your presence is acknowledged and tolerated, but is your voice actually being heard?
Dans mon milieu de travail, on prend toujours pour acquis que je vais être une bonne travaillante puis que je suis intelligente. Mais ça, en fait, ça légitime juste que tu peux me donner des heures supplémentaires puis que je vais pas me plaindre ou que je vais rester silencieuse, passive puis suivre les ordres de la majorité.
Asian people in particular, what they experience is the phenomenon called the bamboo ceiling, similar to the glass ceiling for women, that makes it particularly difficult to break through due to, in large part, the organizational culture and myths and stereotypes that people have about racialized minorities, including Asian people.
The second problem with the model minority myth is that Asian Canadians are not all the same. Just like our dumplings, we are different inside out. In fact, not all Asian groups in Canada benefit from the same level of financial success and education.
Even within one ethnic group, you would not have had the same experience, but certainly across like country borders and stuff and different generations of immigration.
As much as I think it's great when we kind of group together as Asians and build solidarity, there is a little bit of erasure that happens with individual groups. For Filipinos, as much as it's great to be bunched in and have that sense of community with other Asians, we're quite different from other Asians. We're often omitted. We're often not there. Usually folks talk about Japan, China, and Korea.
Breaking down the data by ethnicity and looking at things like employment and education, you start to realize that not all Asians are crazy rich doctors or real estate moguls. Many of us are working class, are employed in precarious jobs, or lack work stability, education, or access to citizenship. These are the realities that get masked by the model minority myth and feed the false narrative that says that there aren't social needs for Asian communities. Finally, the third problem with the model minority myth is that it is a tool used to divide communities of color. By definition, a model minority cannot exist in a vacuum. For a group to rise as the so-called model, they are pitted against other groups in the same system. Historically, the model minority myth has been used to create a wedge between Asian Canadians and other minorities in Canada. Elevating Asian Canadians as deserving and hardworking diminishes the struggles of other racialized minorities. It minimizes the role systemic racism plays in perpetuating inequality. So to sum it up, the model minority myth is problematic because it silences our voices, it masks different realities and challenges that our communities face, and it creates divisions between people of Asian descent and other minority groups. So what actions can we take as individuals and as a society to dispel this label?
Education. Education is so important. And, you know, it's a continuing education from both sides.
The less we talk about it, the less the system is going to change.
To speak for ourselves, to speak truth to the issues that we experience, and in what ways then are we also the drivers for change?
We have to fight for that because we cannot get there with just staying silent. You can join protests, you can lobby politicians.
We should be working together to collectively and collaboratively address our common concerns because we are actually seeking the same thing, equity and equality for all people.
If we don't start the discussion, who will?
Thank you. Thank you, Shirley. So any thoughts about this video, whether it's around how positive stereotypes can actually negatively impact individuals and groups, whether, you know, it's on, you know, some of the issues that the video speak to either historically or current context about, you know, the model minority myth. Any thoughts about what was presented in this video? Thoughts, comments, or questions? Andy?
I think one of the things that the video didn't address was the expectation that Asians to be quiet. And we're seen as good workers, but never good leaders. And that's very important because Asians just have a different style of leadership, which may work even better in many circumstances than the strongman type of masculine leadership, but it's just not recognized.
So thank you, Andy, for sharing that and you know, allow us to look at the interrelationship, you know, among some of these realities and concepts, because the persistent underrepresentation. So we are not at the decision-making table to actually demand the organizations and the public entities to actually look at the real diversity of our people, that people actually communicate differently. People have different values and beliefs, and they can all be good and bad. And but we have not actually taken the time to actually examine those differences and look at how they could actually improve our work environment and improve the system. But we continue to operate as the other, you know, the current dominant group's values and practice as superior. So I think as a society, we have a vision, we have some ideas, but then I think maybe it is time for us to actually really deepen all of our learning about what would it take for us to be a truly inclusive and equitable society. So, so the model minority, the perpetual foreigner are some of the stereotypes that specifically impact Asian Canadians because it continues to portray us as the other. Therefore, you should not complain because you have it better than the other minority groups. So it's actually using some of the progress we have made and generalize all of us as having made it. And therefore, we should not actually seek justice and equality and greater equality. And so I don't know how many of you actually know that by population per capita, there are more Chinese people live in poverty than other racialized groups. But the stereotype about Chinese Canadian is we all have nice houses and nice cars, and we're all doing well. We're all professionals, which is not true. And but it actually have effectively silenced us from talking about and learning more about the social needs of our community. So, okay, so I'm just conscious about time, Angela and Andy. I see, Kevin, you have your hand up. So maybe I'll have
I
Kevin.
got a quick question about on two videos. One lady, I'm sorry, I forgot her name. She mentioned the two-side education. That means we learn in the deep side from the Western culture. I was thinking from Western, the mainstream should learn minority culture. I understand that way. I like your word, deep learning. That we need to propose something, not just let's see. This definitely, I would say, what we have currently doesn't work.
Right. So I think we have been making progress, but I think we can all do better. I think that's why we produced the most recent set of 5 videos. So today we actually look at 3 out of the 5. So I hope that you consider taking time to look at some of this video and continue the conversation. You can be with your family, you could be with your children and grandchildren, with the friends you have tea or coffee with, and you know, and maybe meet at the Chinese Cultural Center and continue the conversation. So I see that Mr. Chen, Pui Ling Chen, have also your hand up.
Yes, one thing that I would like to see us do more is to talk to our fellow Asian Canadians, to speak up. Because I live in Ottawa. I have been involved in the political process for quite a bit. The biggest challenge about speaking out actually is within our own community. A lot of, I can use Chinese as an example. I actually say it to them every now and then is the people come from Hong Kong, a lot of them have their minds colonized. They actually think the white people are better. The challenge that I had for the last 40 years, more are from within than outside. I don't know if anybody faced, have the same experience.
And that's why we're producing these educational materials, because not only that we have not had the opportunity to be educated when we went to post-secondary or high school in this country, our children actually who are born raised here have not been actually exposed to this history of racism. Most of the young people are telling us, the impact of this educational resource is helping them to verbalize, to describe their experience, and to talk about what's happening to them and what's happening in society, because they don't have the vocabulary. That's why we introduced the concept of internalized racism, because we start thinking, oh, maybe in this country, we cannot be a premier of the country. We cannot be the superintendent of school. Studies have shown that a lot of Black children actually do not think they can be teachers. They're only good enough to be teachers' aides. And a lot of children of color don't think they should be principals because they have never seen one. Sometimes they would go through the school system for 12 years, not seeing a person of color as a school principal. So that's why we have to actually, we produce these learning resources. We can start that conversation. We know the vocabulary to use. And so we now know that we are being, described as model minorities. And while some people benefit from it, but then those who actually do not fit that stereotype are feeling, well, this does not speak to me. I want to be an artist. I'm not going to be an engineer. So why can I be a good Chinese Canadian even if I'm not good in math? So I think we have to start challenging these ideas. My background is social work. And I know it is not easy for Asians to actually talk about the social needs of our community, because people are saying, well, you have it better than the Black people and the Indigenous, therefore you should not be complaining. I think once we break that from our mental, break that mentality, then we can start to advocate for our community. We can actually start to speak up and demand, equality. So I don't know whether Kevin is still here. one of the things that I actually, I started doing about 10 years back now, 10, 15 years, is I stopped using the word mainstream to describe white people. For Chinese Canadians who have contributed to this country, the building of this country, for 160 years, we are mainstream. Chopsticks is mainstream Canadian. So we are mainstream. So I use the word broad-based to describe, broad-based, and we are all mainstream. So once we find the vocabulary to describe our experience, we can also change our vocabulary to claim our equality and claim our equal citizenship. So that has been part of my learning. And so I think, like I said in the beginning, we actually presented a lot to you today. I hope that you have time to take in some of this, digest it. All our resource material are free for anyone, any group to use. So if we would like to use
we'll allow one more question from Kevin before I ask for some final thoughts and some closing remarks from Angela too. Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you, Andy. Actually, so it's mainstream. Yeah, I agree with you. Everybody's the mainstream. That's obviously the words need to be redefined, or you need to change the words. Or change. Obviously, the words is just the surface. You change your mind, open your mind and curiosity to outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I like that. Change the rules. And remember, Teresa. Chopsticks in the mainstream. That's a good concept to remember. Now, before I ask Andrew to see a few closing remarks, do you have any final thoughts to wrap up today's presentation? Teresa?
Oh, me? Oh, okay. So, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity for Shirley and I to join you today on this journey to deepen our understanding on issues of discrimination and racism in this country. Whether you're a parent or grandparent, I think that you can actually help your next generation to start that conversation. And I think this is really opportune time to actually have this conversation with our family, with our colleague, with our community. I just spent yesterday the whole day participating in the National Summit on Anti-Semitism. Today, the Prime Minister sat through all day to listen to people from the Muslim community. Today is on Islamophobia. So I think as Asians, we should also maybe look at how we actually work together so that we can have our issues better understood and our voices heard. So I thank you for taking time out today to share this session.
Thank you, Teresa. I noticed that Angela Chen is here with us. Angela is the president of the Chinese Cultural Center of Greater Toronto, the lead organization, the Stronger Together initiative. Angela, why don't you make the closing remarks?
Yes. Thank you very much, Teresa and Shirley, for presenting today's webinar. You have given us a lot of food for thought, Teresa. I've been, my brain hasn't stopped turning and churning while you were doing all these videos, presentation. And I see that education is really very important in order to get this matter while moving forward. So I do hope that you will come back again and continue with another webinar in the near future so that I think we could all try to work together to create some sort of educational program in regard to advancing towards your goal, which is so very important. And it is the right time now that we should do that. Thank you very much, Teresa.
Well, thank you for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And thank you to Teresa and Shirley for a wonderful presentation. And I've been in this field for a long time, and I learned something new again today, and I'll continue to learn. So for those who are here, thank you very much for attending this webinar. If you want to watch the recording, it will be available through the Chinese Cultural Center website. and we'll also be
the Stronger Together.
The Stronger Together initiative, okay. And we'll also put it on the CPAC website if you want to go that route. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, and have a great evening. Goodbye.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
you. Yeah. Bye.